Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I would like to talk to you now about two key figures in early 20th century Northern California poetry, George Sterling and Nora May French. On the one hand, Sterling was the leader of influential literary circles in the Bay Area and Carmel by the Sea, and he managed to bring California poetry to national attention with the publication of The Testimony of the Suns in 1903 and A Wine of Wizardry in 1907. On the other hand, his protege, Nora May French, quickly gained a strong local reputation and was seen as destined for national prominence, at least until her tragic death by suicide at just 26 years old. Now, despite their importance, critics have often described this poetry as only about nature, just a reworking of 19th century English Romanticism, that is, escapist and idealistic. In other words, reduced to pretty pictures of California scenery. But, and this is key, I want to argue here that this is a 21st century bias about what the lyric means. My goal today is to challenge these views by using the framework of historical poetics. With this approach, we'll see how the material conditions of the time, and especially publishing and circulation, actually encourage a much broader variety of purposes, going far beyond the pastoral narrative. So, how do we get there? Well, we need a different lens, and this lens is provided by historical poetics. This approach emerged in the 200s as a reaction against what its scholars saw as overly decontextualized literary criticism. For most of the 20th century, the lyric was understood as the timeless, universal expression of an author's subjectivity. That is, something detached from history, something private that eventually reached public recognition. However, as Joby Prince reminds us, before this modern idea, poetry was understood as many different verse genres, and many of them were never meant for print at all. Virginia Jackson took this further with her groundbreaking work on Emily Dickinson. She showed that Dickinson's poems often appeared in letters, scraps of paper, or even fascicles. They had specific social and communicative purposes. They were not just abstract expression of universal feeling. So, from this angle, historical poetics sees poetry as a heterogeneous cultural product, shaped by the material conditions of production and, crucially, by circulation, both inside and outside of print. And why does this matter? Well, because it allows us to bring into focus poems that had been invisible to literary history. It lets us see the broader cultural and social roles. So, to sum up, historical poetics reminds us that poetry at the turn of the century had multiple social lives. It wasn't just meant to be read, it was also meant to be used. And this perspective is essential if we want to rethink Northern California poetry beyond that misleading idea of it being purely pastoral. Let's move now to explore public circulation of poetry in turn of the century California. Well, it is important to bear in mind that California in the 1900s looked very different from today. Only 50 years after being declared one of the states of the US, it still had low population density and vast, open, and urbanized landscape. So, in this context, figures like Charles Loomis, who was the editor of Land of Sunshine, later retitled Out West, used this image of the untouched, exuberant, and wild nature of California to attract tourists and settlers, and as a result, the landscape became central to California's regional identity. Similarly, Sunset Magazine, which initially functioned as a promotional tool for the Southern Pacific Railroad, focused on boosting tourism by celebrating the natural beauty of California. And over time, it also became a major literary platform documenting ecstatic encounters with the California outdoors. And here lies the crucial point. Poetry became the primary vehicle for this reinforcing of this idealization. So we find that these local magazines, such as Out West and Sunset, strongly favored verse on natural themes, and especially when written in traditional forms, such as the sonnet, or regular meter, such as the iambic pentameter. So we can notice that for Sterling and French, these regional outlets provided accessible publishing opportunities and even a modest source of income, as long as their content aligned with local landscape themes. In the particular case of Nora May French, she published 11 landscape poems in Out West in the period from 1899 till 1905. Poems in which she specifically refers to native natural elements of California. For example, in Down the Trail, she used the manzanita tree and sycamores to turn the land into a mystical space of sensory ecstasy. And in One Day, she again anchored her vision in local flora, like sage, artemisia, and yellow blossoms like the poppy and the buttercup. In a very similar way, Sterling published 4 nature-oriented poems in Sunset in the period from 1896 till 1907. For example, in the Islands of the Blessed, the pines, the wind, and the Carmel coast act as a poetic threshold to a transcendent realm of beauty, presenting California as an idyllic destination. Then, also in The Homing of Drake, Sterling used blank verse to elevate California's nature to the legendary, grounding it in sites such as Drake's Bay. Here, nature becomes a guardian of the state's wealth, aligning perfectly with Sunset's editorial mission to attract travelers to this somewhat untamed frontier. So as you can see, much of their published poetry did reinforce this idealized view of California. And this, of course, is what critics have traditionally emphasized. But here's the turning point. If we only focus on those public poems, we miss a whole other dimension of their work, because many poems circulated privately or never saw print at all, and these reveal very different purposes. Let's start with French, and please feel free to stop the video to read the poems if you need it. First of all, we have to pay attention to the fact that her biography has often been described as tragic, marked by financial concerns, turbulent relationships, and struggles with mental health, including depressive episodes and suicidal thoughts that intensified in 1907. Her unpublished poem At the End, which was never printed or widely shared, shows an early engagement with the idea of suicide because it was written in 1903, perhaps as a poetic pose in this early period of her life. Using quatrains and metrical shifts, the poem stages a conflict between escaping pain and the impossibility of avoiding it, ending ironically with death rather than life as the ultimate source of comfort. Later, in 1907, just a few weeks before she committed suicide, the poem The Suicide, which is a short prose poem written in pencil only 2 weeks before her death and entrusted to her friend James Hopper, portrays the inner torment of a man in severe depression. Through dense metaphor, it conveys psychic agony and a dissociation between body and mind, culminating in a grotesque description of the suicidal act. So both texts reveal how French conceived verse as an intimate space for personal testimony, not necessarily meant for publication. Poetry, therefore, became a medium for processing extreme experiences that could not be voiced under prevailing editorial or social norms. Now, by contrast, Sterling occupied a central position in Northern California's cultural life, leading literary circles and playing a prominent role in communities such as the Bohemian Club and the Ruskin Club. His poem Midsummer 1907, for instance, was written as a direct invitation to the members of the Bohemian Club of San Francisco for the staging of his verse drama, The Triumph of Bohemia, and was originally distributed as a private flyer. Unlike his published work, it takes the form of a verse drama, echoing the very structure of The Triumph of Bohemia. Its playful tone recreates the festive atmosphere of the club, with a dialogue between an owl, which was the club's symbol, and a true bohemian who delivers practical event details while inciting members' enthusiasm. Another example here is Brotherhood, a poem written in 1907, which was actually a sonnet commissioned by the Ruskin Club, a socialist organization. Rather than being intended for publication, it served a community-building purpose, which is inspiring members to cultivate mutual trust and strengthen their collective commitment to social change. So, using stars as a metaphor for socialist thoughts, the poem culminates in a call to action for achieving an, and I quote here, eternal altar to the good, through fraternity in this case. In Sterling's case, then, we find that verse acquired a performative and ritual character, functioning as a tool of internal cohesion, symbolic celebration, and cultural or political mobilization within his communities. So let me now wrap up this presentation. Well, through the lens of historical poetics, we can now see that Northern California poetry was not just regional, not just pastoral, not just escapist. The modern view of the lyric as a printed, autonomous form has hidden the diversity of conditions that shaped poetry at the time. Texts like At the End, The Suicide, Midsummer 1907, or Brotherhood show us that poetry did not only belong to the commercial channels promoting California tourism. Both Sterling and French understood verse as a tool for intervention, whether personal, communal, or ideological. In other words, their poetry had multiple social lives. It wasn't only read, it was also used. By looking at poetry as it was practiced in its own time, rather than through modern assumptions, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the canon. And more importantly, we also recover literary traditions that have long been marginalized. Thank you so much for your attention. This is the bibliography that I've followed, but please, if you have any question, I will be glad to answer. So please, let's talk through the conference chat forum, as I think the experience can be very, very enriching. Thank you so much again.